Setbacks are unavoidable. This was the important part. Giving up is unforgivable. So it is with that mandate from President Joe Biden in mind that pro-democracy forces must today begin a vital, longer-term project. That is not to change any of the values held so dear by so many, but to find a better way to communicate them and to persuade more Americans justifiably feeling like they have to choose between the two. People justifiably more concerned with the cost of everything, like their next car payment or their rent payment or groceries or daycare, or whether or not they can really swing that trip to Disneyland that they promised the kids or hope to. Perhaps it does start and end with just this: how we talk about and communicate and feel people's deep anxiety about our economy. According to the Washington Post, quote, 2/3 of voters rated the economy as not so good or poor, compared to just 1/3 who rated it as excellent or good, according to network exit polls. Of the voters who rated the economy negatively, 69% of them voted for Donald Trump, a significant margin. Make no mistake, Vice President Kamala Harris was running on a strong economy. She had a plan to make it better for everyone, and she talked about those plans in every one of her public appearances. But there was a breakdown. The American people said they preferred someone with no such plan. Vague promises about musings of someday having a plan, promises about changing things or making things better. Someone whose own running mate had once called him, quote, America's Hitler. That's who they chose. So the urgent work today and tomorrow and for however long it takes for Democrats and anyone who was welcomed inside the pro-democracy tent to do this work, however painful it may be, however much we'd rather binge our favorite network shows. This is what has to start today for the sake of our kids, for the sake of their kids. It's time to get to work. No one better to start this conversation with than some of our most favorite experts and friends. Political strategist, MSNBC senior analyst Matt Dowd is here. With me at the table, anchor of MSNBC's 11th Hour, NBC News senior business analyst Steph Rule, and David Jolly, a former Republican congressman from Florida, now an MSNBC political analyst. So Matt Dowd, I'm going to tell a story, because I feel like our conversation last night bookended our conversation around, I don't know, 10 or 11 p.m. on election night in 04, when you, like kind of 2 parts Carrie Mathison, 1 part mad scientist, cracked the code on the exit polls, figured out what was going on, and were able to accurately predict how 04 would end. I feel like last night you cracked the code on Tuesday night. Explain to our viewers.
Sure. Well, thank you, Nicole. I mean, this is a process that I think for everybody is going through. And I think the way we have to look at this is we have to understand what happened before we can actually really talk about it clearly and what went on in the course of this. I'd like to say first, democracy worked Tuesday. It may have not got the result, but 50 states had 50 elections. It all functioned. Probably in the end, 160 million people will have voted. It's getting counted. It's going well. So democracy works, even though the end result right now is dissatisfactory for a lot of people. I think that what happened, and it caught, I think, a lot of us because we assumed because of Donald Trump was disliked by a majority of people and distrusted by a majority of people and was seen as extreme by a majority of people, that would rule the day. And on election day, that same thing happened. A majority of the people that came to the polls on election day disliked Donald Trump. A majority of the people on election day distrusted Donald Trump, and a majority of the people on election day thought he was too extreme. But the problem fundamentally, which often happens in politics in a presidential election, is your fate is determined by the viewpoint of the incumbent president. And so on election day, according to the latest NBC exit polls, Joe Biden's approval rating was 40%, a net -18 approval rating. Every other president who's run for re-election in modern times ends up on election day with the same number they have in approval. So Barack Obama in 2012 had a 51% approval, got 51% of the vote. In 2004, George W. Bush had a 51% approval, got 51% of the vote. When Jimmy Carter lost, he had a 42% approval. He got 42% of the vote in 1980. Every single time. And even a vice president, think of 1988, when Herbert Walker Bush ran against Mike Dukakis. Ronald Reagan's approval rating was 55%. George Herbert Walker Bush got 53%. So the expectation with those fundamentals, ignoring all of the other data, and that approval was driven by perceptions of the economy, as you said to start the show, the expectation would be that a candidate for president by the Democrats or vice president would get around 40 or 41% of the vote. The Vice President Harris, is going to end up with 48% of the vote, which means for the first time in modern history, she's going to outrun the incumbent president's approval by 8 points. That's never happened before. Never happened at all. And one of the things I think that we have to understand is with that in case, you look at every geography, you look at all the demography, and you say what happened. The most predictive result, most predictive factor of how people voted, no matter who they were, was their approval of President Biden. And so for me, when you look at this, and the interesting thing is in the 7 swing states, the vice president ran 4 points better than she did in all the other states when you look at where Donald Trump gained, which means he gained 7 points. Donald Trump gained 7 points in all the other 43 states and only gained 3 points in the swing states, which means her campaign worked. It just couldn't overcome the weight and anchor of Joe Biden's approval number. And that's fine. We might argue with whether voters should or should not. But when you're a voter who's out there trying to make a decision and they can't pay the rent, as you say, the groceries are too expensive, they don't know what they're going to do about health care or daycare, they have all those things, and they're being told, oh, forget about all that, vote, quote unquote, on behalf of democracy. Well, we might think as individuals who are blessed in our lives that we're able to overcome that and we'll be able to do that. But most people in their lives have to focus on just what's right in front of them and the feeding of their children and the care of their parents and all of that. And so that's fundamentals, the perception of the economy, which then moves into the perception of the incumbent president, means that Vice President Harris actually way overperformed what you would expect.
I mean, Steph, that is sort of a data point and a structural way of understanding that what we were watching, this campaign run by some of the most respected people in politics in either party, was a real feat. It also, I think, leaves this structural thing on the table that you really are, and I've been on both sides of this. In the 2008 McCain campaign, President Obama was phenomenal and probably would have won under any circumstances, but George W. Bush had the kind of approval rating that made it next to impossible for a person of his party to have prevailed in 2008. It is also true, though, that the perception of the economy under Biden is what provided the greatest weight to his approval rating. It's probably the largest factor that drove it to its low numbers. Why is that so different from the actual reality of the economy?
Because the fact of the matter is that we came out of the darkest hole, which was COVID, and we then experienced the biggest inflation spike that most of us have in our entire lives. So I can sit here all day with accurate data that talks about jobs and wages. And remind you, even when wages go up, we credit ourselves. When I get a raise, I say, well, it's because I am so good at my job. But when life costs more, I blame the government. Right. And so I can give you all the data that says we had the best economic recovery in the world, which we did. And when President Biden tried to tout that with Bidenomics, everybody flipped out on him, saying, how could you do that? Don't you know we're suffering? Which they are. Because as you said, rent, mortgages, food, try to go on vacation, all of it costs so much more. So you've got scores of people across this country who are not jumping on board to be on Team MAGA and who don't hate Kamala Harris, but they're just saying, my life costs too much money. And I've never experienced this kind of inflation in my life. Who was the person who was in office? And it was Joseph R. Biden. And that's not unique to the United States. We just saw that in practically every election in developed countries where the country just said, why does life cost this much? And they're not connecting the dots of, well, we're coming out of the COVID hole. This is where we are. And that's where we find ourselves today.
That's right.
What'd you say?
I said you're right.
I know. I just wanted to But this week, no one's saying that to me, so I just really needed to hear it again. I haven't heard it.
We're all a little raw.
It's just one compliment. I had to take
You're
it.
correct.
I love that. Yeah.
You are safe.
So let's translate Steph being right into politics, because I think Democrats need a little boost in the arm right now. Winning doesn't make you right, and losing doesn't make you wrong.
Oh, thank you. Can we stop right there? Because I think I told this story yesterday, and I can't remember anymore what happens on TV and what happens in the breaks. But when we won in 2004, we went to wherever you go and talk about it. And Matt Dowd, who is brilliant, was heralded as the smartest pollster to ever live. We won by like the size of a noodle. And if we'd lost, he would have been the dumbest pollster. It's never that, no offense, it's never that simple.
But are you going to give Nicolle and I participation trophies? Because if you are, it's RUHL.
No, but I think this is truly, I mean, all this introspection of Democrats, of course, we'll talk about it. But just because you lost a race doesn't make your values wrong. And it doesn't mean
Or your candidate.
Or your candidate. And it doesn't mean you need to reconsider your values. Steph and I talked about this last night. First of all, the now minority political coalition in the country is as strong as it's ever been. It's at 48 or 49% of the country. So it's not like somehow it got wiped out. I also know this. I spent the last year visiting with Democratic clubs in the state of Florida. And I know this as a journey, as a former Republican now visiting with Democratic clubs in Florida. The values of today's Democratic Party are the values that will take our country forward. They're the values that protect individual liberty, freedom, and economy for all people. They're the values that represent fairness in our economy and in our culture. And they're the values that lift everybody up. That is not the Republican Party. So this introspection of what did we do wrong, I think is a procedural and tactical question. It is not a values-based question. And Democrats today need to be as proud of their values as they were yesterday. And I think what Steph said is interesting because it also threads a little bit with Matthew's point. It is true Biden's numbers were upside down, but the issue may have also been that across the globe in developed countries, this anti-incumbent wave in a post-pandemic economy, I mean, what we learned is among all of the issues, and we knew this might be the case. I think some of us were trying to convince ourselves there were more important issues. But what we learned on Tuesday night is the economy was the most important issue to people. And they could negotiate away some of the other questions about Donald Trump's fitness. And the reality is, over the last 8 years, Republicans better spoke to the economic anxieties of middle America than Democrats did. But that doesn't mean that Democrats aren't right on the issues. And so I don't, we talked about this last night. I don't think an overcorrection for Democrats is in order. In many ways, it's keep doing what you're doing and let's find a way to be more effective at it.
Well, and I don't want to stop without pointing out that Donald Trump doesn't promise anything to help the economy. I mean, Matt Dowd, talk about the disconnect between how people see Donald Trump as the character he played on The Apprentice and what will actually happen in terms of the costs of things if his tariffs become policy.
I mean, Nicolle, I think it's important. I mean, I agree with everything that was said, and Stephanie's said it beautifully, and David's said it well, correctly in all of this. I think that we have to understand that there was a bunch of voters on Election Day that knew exactly all about Donald Trump. They knew they didn't like him. They didn't trust him. They didn't think he really had a plan, but he wasn't the incumbent. And in